Hello and welcome back to Talking Europe. It was like a divorced couple agreeing to let bygones be bygones, announcing the so-called Windsor Framework. The British Prime Minister and the EU Commission President underlined that the UK and the EU are allies, trading partners and friends. The deal on Northern Ireland, struck in February, seemingly put an end to years of tensions following Britain's decision to leave the European Union in June 2016. To discuss where this relationship goes from here, I'm joined by Chris McManus, an Irish MEP from the Left Group in the European Parliament, who's a member of Sinn Féin, and I'm also joined by Charles Tanak, who was for 20 years a British Conservative MEP. And remember that more than 70 British MEPs had to leave their jobs when the UK pulled out of the European institutions. Let's start with Charles Tanak first, who's actually in Bratislava today. He's in Slovakia. Charles, thank you so much for being on the programme. You are a staunch advocate for Britain to rejoin the European Union. But I just want to throw you a quick opinion poll. This is a recent poll from YouGov, which says that among those who believe that the British government is doing a bad job, the top reason that they give is a failure to stop migrants crossing the channel, 52%. So with those kinds of attitudes, isn't it going to be very difficult for you to persuade people in Britain to accept the freedom of movement that comes with rejoining the single market?
On the contrary, one of the reasons that we've had this surge in irregular migration and refugees on small boats is because the United Kingdom left the Dublin III Accords, whereby in the past, anybody arriving in Britain irregularly like that could be sent back to the continent of Europe, to France predominantly, where they were obliged to seek asylum. So actually, Brexit has made this situation worse, not better.
But
it's interesting. Sorry.
Yeah, but public opinion, though, is still not solidly behind freedom of movement, and you're suggesting rejoin, which means entering the single market again, which means freedom of movement.
Well, I saw an opinion poll last week showing that 60%, if there were another referendum, would now vote to rejoin. So I think it depends how you phrase the question. I mean, clearly, freedom of movement, there was a period immediately about a decade ago when there was a very large movement in excess of 3 million EU citizens who came to the UK. And that did cause a lot of pressure on public services, housing, education, and so on. And that caused a problem. But that is no longer the case. Those large migratory movements would never occur in future because the economies of Eastern European countries have grown and unemployment has dropped. So I don't think freedom of movement is a problem. In fact, there's a deficit of some 60,000 EU workers, which the government would welcome back immediately if they could be convinced to come back to Britain. So the reality is that we have a real problem that many professionals, nurses, doctors, in the carers, in our nursing homes and so on, who EU workers left after Brexit at the time of the pandemic and haven't come back.
Chris McManus, we've heard from a member of your party, Sinn Féin, that President Joe Biden is going to be invited to Northern Ireland to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Do you think this Windsor Framework is a new start? Is it the start of a new era?
Has to be, and as I said, we always got to remember that all of this has been caused by the fallout from the Brexit referendum in 2016, which I have to say that the majority of people in the north of Ireland actually opposed. They wanted to stay within the European Union. So the protocol and the subsequent Windsor framework are very much designed to minimise the damage on the island of Ireland, to address the issues, to ensure that we protect the Good Friday Agreement, that we have no hard border on the island of Ireland, and it protects the all-island economy. So yes, I think President Joe Biden coming to, I think he's coming to Ireland both north and south, I think is a very positive move. Hopefully we will at that stage have secure the restoration of the executive by that time in a matter of weeks.
I was going to ask you about that because, of course, aspects of EU law still apply in Northern Ireland. And yet, of course, those members of the executive not being in the EU, they can't shape those laws that apply to them. They can, after the fact, apply this so-called Stormont break, right? But they can't shape the laws that will apply to them at the point of origin. So what do you think the solution is to that?
Well, actually, coincidentally, we had a group of young leaders from the north of Ireland out here in Strasbourg yesterday, and it was the very first question that was asked of me was, you are now in a position where the EU will be crafting legislation and directives and regulations that affect 2 million people in the north of Ireland. And how do we ensure that their voices are being heard? Now, also this week, the Parliament endorsed a report from the Vice President Silva Pereira about the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. And one of the key points that was in that was there needed to be a strengthening of engagement with stakeholders, including the Assembly, but with wider stakeholders in the north of Ireland. It's something I've articulated for some time since I've been out here, that there needs to be a form of direct dialogue, that we need to ensure that at a very early stage we engage on issues of legislative need to ensure that we take on board the opinions. Now, whether or not this is done through different processes, it could be committee to committee between Stormont and the European Parliament. It could be in other forms of direct dialogue. Some have suggested observer. I don't know. That's for wider discussion, but I think it is important.
Let's put those ideas to Charles Tanak, because Charles Tanak, you're actually a dual national now, aren't you, of Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. What do you think about what Chris McManus just said there about that direct dialogue between Stormont and the EU and ways to overcome the remaining hurdles?
Well, I think it's slightly exaggerated, this so-called democratic deficit, because, of course, Norway for the last 30 years has been in the single market and doesn't have any representation in the European Parliament. But it is, of course, closely consulted. Its national parliament is consulted on the legislative process for the single market. And indeed, Sweden often acts as a proxy for Norway in the European Parliament. So there is an issue, but I don't think it's quite as significant as some of the opponents, particularly in the DUP and the TUV and the others who were completely against the Northern Ireland Protocol from the beginning, have tried to make out. But yes, I would be totally open to suggestions to increase the dialogue. I mean, talking is what democracy is all about. And one solution might be that the Irish MEPs in Ireland, in the south, that they have a special remit also to go to the north and talk to the Northern Irelanders as well as those who can vote for them. Maybe the citizens of the north could be given a vote in the European elections for Ireland. I don't know. There are lots of ways around this problem, including, of course, as you say, Stormont, if and when it gets up and running again, which I'm a little bit sceptical about. It's interesting that I'm actually more or less on the same side, and you couldn't put cigarette paper between myself and my MEP former colleague from Sinn Féin, which is quite interesting, because on this issue, I think all sensible, moderate people want peace, security, stability on the island of Ireland, want to have a facilitation of trade, which the Windsor Framework will bring about between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland has the best of both worlds, being both in the EU single market, but also in the United Kingdom single market and customs zone, as well as being part of the UK, which, as far as we can tell, is still the majority view in Northern Ireland. But of course, the majority of Northern Irelanders voted to stay in the European Union. And I believe the majority of Northern Irelanders support the Northern Ireland Protocol. And they also support the recent agreement between Sunak and the European Commission in the Windsor Framework. So I'm positive, but of course, we need to convince our friends in the DUP and the TUV to fall into line and support it too, which may be a bit of a challenge, to put it mildly.
Just to go back to Chris McManus, you've been quite vocal about human rights issues, which have been, you said, somewhat forgotten in all the recent discussions about all the political arrangements. And as we said at the beginning of this discussion, the UK asylum bill is this quite controversial issue, and it could possibly lead to the UK government pulling out of the Convention on Human Rights, which, if happens, would have an impact on Northern Ireland as well. What prescriptions would you give in that sort of situation?
Well, the first thing we need to recognise is the cornerstone of all of this that we've all been trying to ensure remains protected and remains in situ, and that we hold in high regard, and that's the Good Friday Agreement. And the European Convention of Human Rights was the foundation stone of the Good Friday Agreement. And look, I understand that probably some of the threats coming from British ministers to leave the convention may be more about political posturing than actually a real prospect. But that will be a decision for them to take. But if it does come to pass, and I hope it does not come to pass, and that the British government will then have to consider what system it puts in place for convention rights to apply to the North. Because I've said, and this is fundamental, is the ECHR underpins the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement is, through all of the debris that has come out since 2016, has been what we've been trying to protect.
OK, we'll have to see where this reset goes from now on between the UK and the EU, and how things shape up in Northern Ireland as well. Thank you so much to both of my guests, Chris McManus and Charles Tanak, and that's all for this edition of Talking Europe. Thanks for watching.